So you have bacteria, nothing but bacteria for 1.5 billion years as far as anybody can make out. Then you have these eukaryotic cells joining them, but then not becoming anything that you can actually see for what? What is that? Another 1.5 billion years, I guess. Something very close to that. And then about 535 to 540 million years ago, bingo, you get an explosion of life. And I do think it is a Cambrian explosion. We are, as paleontologists, we were having a conversation outside about this. How real is the phenomenon and what caused it if it's a real phenomenon? I'm of this school that thinks that within about 8 or to 10 million years, there was a radical diversification of major kinds of life, which are the forerunners of all the major kinds of macroscopic animal life that we still have around us today. This is a trilobite. It's a very complex organism. In life, it would have had, oops, I'm pointing at myself, pair of antennae, 3 pairs probably of legs under the head, pair of legs under each of these segments, and then there's a rudimentary tail back here. This is a very complex kind of an animal, and yet you find these things, bingo, right down there at the base of the Cambrian. We could talk about that. I'm sure in your subsequent meetings there's going to be discussions of the Cambrian explosion because creationists love the Cambrian explosion when they're going to admit that there was a Cambrian at all. I mean, basically a lot of creationists don't think that we can rationally discuss 535 million years ago because that didn't happen. But if it did happen, then they use the Cambrian explosion to argue against evolution. And I think that that's fascinating. I've got to leave it now, although maybe that'll be a subject for the pit out there to follow this up more. Let me move on to some of the understanding of the dynamics of the evolutionary process. I still have some time here. Now here's a very... I apologize for the starkness of this diagram. It's sort of hyper-analytic rather. Well, it's not even. It's just compared to that gorgeous trilobite. This is really just a bunch of lines, and it's really not very thrilling. But to me, it cuts the guts of a lot of what the history of life looks like to me, and also poses the problems that evolutionary theory needs to address and needs to solve. And I think we're making a lot of headway on it. This is forget the 5s, that's just taken from an illustration of one of my papers. Here's a line, it just runs vertically. This is time going up. This is an axis of anatomical change, this way. This line should actually be rendered more as a block. And what it says is that as you go through time, and as an invertebrate paleontologist, I'm talking about typically 5 to 6 to 7 million years of time, a lot of time. Typically, in my stuff in the Paleozoic, but also if you look at things from the last 10 to 20 million years, doesn't matter if you're on land or sea, if you're looking at horses or you're looking at clams, you get basically the same pattern in almost all species. The phenomenon is called stasis. This is something that turns out, we thought we were discovering this, but this was known in the 19th century, but sort of shoved under the rug because people didn't expect it and didn't know how to explain it. It's still quite interesting, this tremendous stability. What the line means is that, and it fails to convey, really, that there is variation within every population. I mean, we're varying amongst ourselves in this room. Of course, we're not a population because we don't all live together, we've been convened, but nonetheless, maybe the variation is slightly increased because of that, but nonetheless, within every local population of any species, there is variation. We all know that. There's variation within a family. Then there's variation if you look at, I don't know, robins or take any species you want and look over their entire geographic spread, they vary. Okay, so this doesn't convey that variation. But the idea is that if you've got variation going on within and between populations up to and including the entire geographic distribution of a species, that variation in the old days was routinely supposed to have been translated in some sort of a evolutionary direction away from the average. And what we're saying is that 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, for the most part, the fossil record shows that if you sample up here and you sample down here and you sample anywhere in between, you get something that is statistically insignificantly different from where you started from, basically. And that's a big shock, and that's a big surprise. It's one of the notions of, that's the fundamental empirical underpinning of the notion of punctuated equilibrium. The reason why I'm still talking about it 30 years later, though, is I got this group, and there's other people too, trying to figure out how do you explain stasis. And I've had fights, I've gotten into arguments in the literature and all sorts of things, but people actually saying, well, you know, the biologists can explain that, and paleontologists are in no position to explain it. But it's only when you really get together across the table and really thrash this out. What we did, this is really neat. The last two meetings of our group in Santa Barbara, the geneticists just said, well, wait a minute, let's make a list, an exhaustive list of absolutely every genetic process that we can think of that contributes to the creation of variation and basically the control of it and the sort of the restriction of variation. So they looked at mutation, various aspects of mutation, rates and degrees and so on and so forth. They looked at natural selection. They did all sorts of things. And we kept throwing out ideas and so forth. And they kept striking off the traditional genetic explanations off the list. It was actually thrilling because where we came down to was the second of these two explanations for stasis that I very briefly want to give you, but I'm very excited about them. The genetics group came down to the second of these. The first one of these, though, is, I think, just correcting some old-fashioned natural history that made sense when it was promulgated, but it was wrong, and I think deeper thinking should have revealed that it would be wrong, and that is this notion of habitat tracking. I don't know precisely what goes on around here in terms of, I'm an amateur bird watcher. I picked this up in about the mid-1980s, and so I was learning tufted titmice and cardinals and a number of other things for the first time in my life in my backyard in the mid-80s, and I was very surprised to find very soon that if I had been doing this back in 100 years earlier, in 1900, not in the year 2000 or 1985 anyway, things like tufted titmice and cardinals weren't there in the New York area, simply weren't there. There's been a host of changes. Most of them reflect the presence now of historically more southern species in New York. Why? Because the climate's warming up. We know that. And the big debate is to what extent is that human-induced and to what extent is that sort of a natural thing that's going on. I think a lot of it's human-induced, but whatever. Organisms tend to track environmental change by moving geographically. I can't emphasize this more. If you look at the history of plants and animals, animals and plants in the terrestrial ecosystems, but also the mollusks and other kinds of invertebrates along the shoreline, during the Ice Age, the last 1.65 million years, there have been 4 major incursions of continental ice sheets down roughly to this area. Actually, it stopped a little bit further north, but made Long Island, 2 of the terminal moraines made Long Island and so forth. Tremendous disruption of the physical environment. I mean, what was it? 18,000 years ago, New York City, what is now New York City, was under a half a mile thickness of ice. I mean, that's a profound change. Well, what happened was it happened sufficiently slowly that these biomes that are located, so you have the tundra, then you've got the boreal forest, then you've got the mixed hardwoods and what have you, collapse down in front of it. Now, do they do it real neatly and it's all orderly? Of course not. Some species move faster than others. There's all sorts of rearrangements of local ecosystems and so on. But as long as species can move and find recognizable habitat in terms of nutrient supplies that are requisite and the kind of soils, if you're a plant, that you need, and the right temperature regimes and the right amount of water and so on and so forth, what happens is that natural selection, sure, is operating all the time, but it's a stabilizing natural selection even in the face of environmental change, as long as the species can find suitable habitat and utilize the existing adaptations. In other words, it's a tremendously conservative system. Okay? And once the vector dies back, in this case global cooling pulse, the glaciers retreat back up, and you get this succession going on. Like, there's a very few examples, a surprisingly few examples, of both extinction and evolution, either in the terrestrial or the marine record, in the last 1.65 million years. It's just astonishing, less than I would have actually have predicted.